This show is brought to you by Sparkade, our ADHD game-based learning platform that helps kids transform challenges into opportunities. Parents and educators, join the waitlist at play.sparkade.app/waitlist and be among the first to experience Sparkade when we launch. That is play.sparkade.app. You've landed at Spark Launch, the guide star for embracing what it means to be neurodiverse. I'm Mike Cornell, joined by CEO of Spark Launch, Chaya. Here, we navigate mental health triumphs and tribulations from all across the spectrum, charting a course to the shared experiences that unite us, and discovering how to embody the unique strengths within neurodivergent and neurotypical alike, igniting your spark and launching it into a better tomorrow. Hello there, I'm Mike.
I'm Chaya.
And today we are joined by Gabriela Tardea, a visionary leader reshaping how organizations harness neurodivergent talent. As a senior business consultant and neuro-inclusive advocate, she has pioneered AI tools like the Artificial Intelligence Leader Assistant to create adaptive workplaces. Gabriela's work has been featured in HR Tech Weekly and Neurodiversity at Work podcasts, and she's advised companies like Unilever to dismantling bias in hiring. Welcome to the show.
Welcome, Gabriela.
Thank you both, Chaya and Mike, for having me on Spark Launch. I guess it's called Spark Launch Neurodiversity Ignite, which is pretty inclusive as a name itself. I've been really following your podcast, and I truly appreciate you bringing together diverse voices, also to shed light on various aspects of neurodiversity. So it's an honor for me to contribute to the important dialogue.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. Why don't you share your background and why do you have this deep calling to serve this community, and especially in the HR space, companies? What's going on? What do you see, and how do you make a difference?
Well, I will start by saying that my journey into neurodiversity consulting stems from long years working in HR in various roles, from recruitment to training up to coaching. And when you speak about HR, it's a very broad term because there are many things you can engage with, but mostly the work with people, and throughout these years, understanding their needs and how to adapt solutions in workplaces that supports employees to work together in teams, and mostly neurodivergence because they work differently. But not only, I would say also neurotypical brains would need some different types of work support depending on situations such as well-being. Like if you are in a situation where you go through a personal issues, your work might be affected in that matter. So I've seen this through the roles that I play, that workplaces are not just boxes filled with checklists that follow specific standards, but need to be adapted depending on the people that you have on. So that is where it started, by observing and seeing the need for specific changes within organizations. So I would put it as the beginning of, right? The realization, all this realization kind of led me to focus on bridging this gap between what company actually want to do, because I've observed a gap between organizations' intentions to be inclusive. I think most of organizations, they do want. I haven't found yet an organization who would say, no, we intentionally want to do worse. I think everyone has the intention to do it, but there is a gap between what the intention is, and to be really inclusive means also to have tangible actions, and that's kind of lacking. And bridging the gap, I found that there is where I could contribute most, helping companies not only understand neurodiversity, but also implement practical strategies just to foster truly inclusive workplaces. And here I will really emphasize on, aside from what's written on paper, because there is a lot of intentions and a lot of organizations have started to act on it by speaking up on practices, on what they actually do. But in practice, looks different.
Yeah, you brought about such a good point about intentions and actions, right? Because we might be this need within us to be inclusive, but we don't know how. And because of that, we are missing out, right? So it's not just watching training and, just checking boxes, but how do we take all that information and actually implement it where we'll see the differences. So that's where you come in. How do you fill that gap? And what do you see there?
Well, in terms of solution, I think the theory can tell us a lot, right? There are a lot of theoretical solutions that can be put in place, but in theory, a lot less would work. And I would say also, of course, differences in culture and location will take place. What I want to say is that it will differ. Like if I would have to suggest something as a solution, I will have to understand, first of all, the culture of the organization, the context. The context matters a lot, and to understand the people within it before anyone would provide kind of a solution. I think the mistake that some companies are making is that they take the theory as bullet points. This is what we have to do based on research, and also looking at what, for example, organizations such as Microsoft are doing. And they don't take into account their size, their location. They just take into account the advice, the final results, and they try to implement it. And then they wonder why it doesn't work. It doesn't work because to find a solution for anything, you will have to start to understand by understanding the culture, the context. So I always start from this perspective and always advise, before I will give you a solution, I will have to look at your culture. I will have to make an audit of your current context to better understand how you function as an organization, how your people have to work, and how they currently perform before I move on in providing solutions. There are certain points where I would start and say, if you want now an answer, I would start with revising the recruitment processes. That's one thing. I think every organization will start from there. And then by fostering inclusive work environments in action, meaning like really find one thing that works in your company and then do just that. And not only say it in writing, but preach and really see if your people are following, like if they live by that standard. And then the third one would be to provide targeted training. And when I say training, not necessarily to train the neurotypical alone, but the entire organization, and change a little bit the mindset, because ultimately we do not need extraordinary action to make some changes. We just need a shift in mindset from both the employees and the managers who are leading these initiatives. Because if you don't have their buy-in, no action will work long term, and it will be actually an additional task that you put on your daily task at work, which will make you suffer more than if you would not have it. So yes, to answer this broadly, I will start with an audit. And I think it's important that people understand that what works for a big organization might not work for a smaller one. Either in size, like I would say, would not apply for a big organization to another big one, because you still need to understand the vision of the organization. What do they need to accomplish, and what type of people do they need, and do they have the right people, and what kind of people they want to keep. So it really depends on context.
Could you walk us through what would be a typical audit situation for you, and like where would you start and what would you look for, and how would you like kind of go through the process?
Yes. Based on an example of a practical consulting project that I recently done, starting from the premise that the organization lack maybe resources, or at least they wanted to identify what can they do to keep people in, right? The initial thought that this is the main challenge that they have was not necessarily wrong, because there were enough resources. But by making an audit of the culture of the organization, looking at how do they bring people in. And that was very important for me to understand that everything starts not necessarily from the day one when the employee starts and working in the organization, rather from the moment you post the job description. The moment you send a message out there, we're looking for that kind of person. When the job description is not clear enough, you will kind of go back and forth in trying to make the recruitment work and this would be the first step that I suggested initially, to revise the recruitment process. Start with a clear understanding of what message does the company send when they post a job description asking, we need a brilliant candidate for role X, right? So we need, let's say, a marketing manager who would reshape the brand or at least make us be more visible. If the job description is not clear enough, you will invite a lot of people in who see themselves in the role but not really able to perform the task. And there is where the challenges in the recruitment department or in the HR peers, like we are struggling to find the right candidate. When we look at the job description, and then, for example, I would have a discussion with the hiring manager trying to really understand what kind of person do you really need? Like, walk me through a day in a life of this person. What tasks are you in need for that person to perform? Is it important for that person to work here with you at the desk, or is this a remote job? Like, very clearly identify the performance, or at least the task that the person is needing to perform, so that both the recruitment is successful, but also the onboarding and later on retaining that employee, right? And when that is clear, and I go back to the job description and I revise a little bit to see, does that message really transpire within the job description that you've posted there? And I would say in 90% of the cases, will not. So we start from really understanding what type of culture that organization has, maybe what type of culture they want to build, because maybe the culture needs also a little bit of shift. And we start looking step by step on actions, where actions have to be taken to at least see a change. So we started with the rewriting the job descriptions, having it very clear what kind of person we want to come in, to have in, having interviews also with people, the recruitment process to be as clear as possible, and have clarity around the expectations and have transparency regarding the salary, for example. That is also a big discussion in interviews, where you might just lose very capable and competent individuals, like candidates, just because of the discussion whether or not they fit in with this within the salary range that the company can offer. And there is where you can negotiate with the organization and say, do you prioritize competency over higher salary? So if you would pay a little bit more, but you make sure that you get the right person in this role, would this make a difference? So we try to kind of balance a little bit the expectations of the company and bridging a little bit that gap between also the understanding of what candidates might expect. So once that is a little bit more clear, then we start acting. And I've seen changes by really implementing practical action, like strategies that are needed in that moment. Instead of giving, for example, the company a report on the best practices or what I could find out there that the company could do, rather I would come with very specific action and saying, even this job market in today's, like, I would say for the next 3 months, and the vision you guys have needing this person as soon as possible, let's act this way. And then, you outline the suggestions based on the research. So I work a lot based on specific results and specific actions now, not so much in, I'll send you a PowerPoint, you'll find everything there. Did I answer your question?
Oh, yeah. I think that's so interesting about starting language changes early and adjusting also the mindset of who's coming up with the language, of ensuring there's different types of inclusivity and accommodation that we don't think of. We think of the obvious ones for neurodivergence. I think it's so interesting that you bring up something as simple as salary can be made more inclusive and can be made more accommodating for people. Going a little bit more, I'm kind of interested in the need for more explicit language, pretty much top down. Do you talk a little bit more about that and how the lack of explicit language is often kind of a danger factor for neurodivergent employees?
I mean, this is a very good approach of how you're having, because it all starts with very small things, right? When I speak often with organizations about neuro-inclusion, I very often stress that the gap isn't so much the lack of awareness in itself, it's the lack of actionable embedded change. Like, really, what can you do now? And so I like to frame it also around 3 ways, specific steps that will help, for example, organizations to really act with very practical insights into, okay, what can I do now, right? I would say step 1, revise the recruitment process practices, as I mentioned, with neuro-inclusive lens, meaning look at the wording itself. And you asked me for a specific example. In my consulting work, I often start with the job description audits. And then one organization, for example, that I worked with recently had description full of phrases such as, and I would give an example quoting from the real job descriptions, which I've also audited and also tried to write about on my LinkedIn profile. A phrase like must thrive in fast-paced environments. That's a word that you will find in most of job descriptions. That's a typical kind of copy-paste language that companies don't really pay much attention to. Or another example would be strong multitasker with excellent verbal communication. These sound very standard, but are often exclusionary for neurodivergent applicants because by rewriting, for example, the descriptions using very clear skill-based language, such as able to focus on detailed tasks with precision instead of detail-oriented. What is detail-oriented? Like, in which task would you refer to? So if you're very specific as to what actually you mean, I need a person who is able to focus on details tasks, like on those very small details with precision in that specific task, then it's much more clear for anyone, also a neurotypical brain, right? Another example, I would say comfortable with independently working with specific goals. That means instead of saying fast-paced, be very specific in explaining that the manager expects that you are comfortable working independently with structured goals. For example, I would give an example of one situation that I've been in. I would work faster. I would give to this specific fast pace, right? I would work faster on a task if I'm allowed to work the way I can best. For example, if the manager would drag me into the office and have me sit at the desk in noise or in an environment which does not allow me to focus, I would spend maybe 2 hours on a task which would take me maybe 10 minutes if I would have my own environment, right? Does it make sense on the difference? And this is what they don't understand. They feel like if we give everything, like all the indications to the employee, they will have to perform. But often, even if you are capable of performing that job, if you do not have the right environment to thrive in, you might not perform the task as expected. So we also advise them to implement an alternative application format, like, for example, work samples. It's easier to have discussions with applicants and walk them through a specific case. Like, knowing what you're expecting from them, you give them a case on how this work, like what we expect from you to do on once you've learned about our practice and everything, after you go through onboarding, how would we expect you to work? So give a very specific, realistic example of what you expect from them, and then or at least listen the feedback that they give you and see if that resonates with you. And you will learn a lot from the employees. You might even learn new ways of doing a task. So I would put it this way: by analyzing specific actions you're taking currently and see if they are clear enough. If for you, they might be clear because you've been doing that for many years, right? But have someone close to you or someone that might not understand your language, that knows nothing about your role, and explain them those expectations. If they don't get it, or ask a child. If they don't get it, then you might need to rephrase it. And here, I don't want to emphasize that they have to double down, like they have to go as explanatory as possible. For example, I have been kind of given an input as to, but I don't have to explain as a 5 years old. No, but as to a 5 years old. But you have to just be very specific as to what you expect, because by saying you have to be a strong multitasker with excellent verbal communication skills, like, does that mean that I will have to do, like, without breaks, to do a lot of tasks whenever you feel like it? What if you're busy every day? So it has to go a little bit more specific than just putting that kind of language in communication.
Yeah. So many of those descriptions are I mean, they're sometimes not even remotely accurate to the job. I mean, how many times have you heard fast-paced environment and it's not a fast-paced environment at all? It's kind of lazy copy and paste for job descriptors. And then you bring up I don't want to explain to them like a 5-year-old thing. It's like, well, technically this is actually you being lazy at putting together a job description. So this really is falling on you more than anything else. And I think there is a assumption that when it comes to accommodations of any kind for anybody, that it's transactional. I give you this accommodation, you then give me the work that I need you to do instead of actually setting up the employee for the best success, which in turn rewards you as the higher up who is employing this employee. And it's very strange where that's where you get, well, we'll allow them to turn off the lights, or something. It's all small things like, it's very transactional. I'm buying your productivity, essentially. And I come across a lot of people who are having a horrible time at work because they're going through that's not allowing to be able to work things the way they are particularly able to work at them, which and it all ends up in the same exact place. Like this person could get this particular project done to you in the same amount of time that you want it, just done in a completely different way if you allow them to work at it in the way they can personally think about it. There's just like anything that involves numbers for me. It's actually easier if I go backwards. Don't know why, just is. But if you force me to go forwards with them, well, then I'm going to be about 3 hours behind you at all times. But if you allow me to do the work the way my brain happens to find it easier, or like you said, in an environment like, let me be closed off. Let me listen to music or have headphones on or whatever else. And let me be a little bit more independent. There's always the assumption that neuro-inclusive doesn't equal independent, but actually we are more capable of actually working independently and without instruction than anybody else, as long as you are clear and implicit about it.
And I'll give another example from an experience that I had with an executive working. I was doing some coaching sessions with him, and he had this challenge with an employee saying, look, I have this employee challenge. I don't get it. Like the employee is very extroverted. Like you will see that person at a party or in the hallway and will talk with everyone. And so I get it. Like he's able to communicate very well with everyone in the organization. The moment we turn into a meeting, he's the quietest person. Like you will kind of struggle to get something out of that person. How do I deal with that? There is this general assumption that if people see you chatting and happy during a break time, that's the kind of personality you have everywhere, right? Whereas I try to make the leader, like through guidance, through coaching, to understand a little bit, not so much as to what you think that the employee thinks or knows or is able to do. Rather, have an open discussion with the employee and try to understand the context. And it came out through this coaching after a few sessions that the employee, yes, you will have an extrovert person who would chat and be funny, and it will be kind of the joy of the group in normal setting, like in break settings or during lunchtime. But then you will have that same person in a meeting, not necessarily responding. Why? Because that person was the kind of person who would think through before answering. So if the meeting goes in a very fast-paced way, right? And then the manager speaking, they are bringing in their input as to what we have to do and so on. That person needs to think before answers. For example, they were given certain indications as to what the task will be for the next quarter. The employee would not answer, not because the employee did not know the answer, but because he had to kind of process as to, okay, how the entire work will work for me? How would I have to do the task? Am I capable of doing the task? Is it clear enough for me why I have to do this task? Is it in line with the vision of my role or anything? So what I suggested, and actually this was through coaching, the manager coming with the solution himself, is to present these points in meetings and giving the employee an opportunity to reflect about it. And instead of having 1.5 hour meeting where you discuss everything in one, take a break in between, leave the employee reflect a little bit about what you've just said, and then get back in and discuss kind of the outputs. And that was the success of the leader saying, like coming back and sharing the success of not having to do special trainings or accommodation regarding how do I help that employee? Do I send him to trainings for him to learn how to better communicate and express whatever? It wasn't that issue. It was only in the manager's mind that the employee would not act as he was expecting. But after that short break, when the employee had that half an hour time to reflect on what was said and then put it into action in his own mind, like in his own way, put it in the schedule, trying to identify are these goals connecting with my vision for this role and my role in itself, then stepping in back into that meeting, he would not necessarily come with the frustration or the anger or the anxiety of do I do that? I have to say, because sometimes if you're not sure, you'll have to agree with it just to keep your job, like to be seen, like you know what you're saying, right? But then a complete shift has happened. Like after that half an hour, the employee would come in and then a lot of them would say, yes, I agree and it makes sense. It aligns with my expectations. And they would even get input for the manager saying, oh, but this task, I could actually, instead of planning it for 3 months, I think I could finish them in 1 month if I do it this way, right? So they would come even with input and solutions and identifying how do I complement, maybe even with colleagues, identifying I'm not so good at this task, but I could help my colleague and my colleague could take in some other tasks. So just having this open discussion, but by allowing that half an hour for the employee to reflect on what has been given has changed the dynamics of the communication. And yes, there were questions, there were unclarities, but it wasn't really thrown at them and the employee having to kind of give an answer on spot. So making a little bit of mindset shift. And this is where I'm saying, like, you do not have to act as a huge, innovative, transformational kind of solution to find an answer to your challenge. Just listen a little bit. At least just do something that will give you back a little bit of feedback as to, for example, the employee might have come to the manager and say, we're not prepared for this. We need more training for this. That would be an action, right? The employee has told you that. But at least and the employees feel confident that the answer that they provided was thought through, was not just thrown there out of fear for speaking in meetings.
Yeah, you brought about such a good point because communication is so different with everybody, right? Some people think through, they have to introspect, they need that quiet time, then just coming up with quick answers. That's definitely me. I'm a deep thinker. I just would be quiet because I can't just come up with something without having done my own research, right? So it's just about actually understanding people, use empathy to connect. And if something is, you need an employee to speak up, just have that one-on-one conversation with them, understand them, and accommodate for them, whatever that is, right? And you just need empathy to do that.
Yes, and I say this too often, and sometimes it sounds so simple that it comes even like, oh, people, when they think about inclusion or solutions to how do we change the culture, they think that they need to do such tremendous work and they don't have time for it. And, how can I put one more project on my desk today or this quarter? It's not about that. And very often is a small action just like this. For example, taking a break within like half an hour within meeting to clarify understanding expectations and everything that has been said can make such a tremendous difference in the way employees engage, because it's also ultimately about engagement, not so much about performance per se, because that employee has been through a recruitment process. You have kind of tested that employee, their skills. You have believed from the very beginning that that employee might be able to perform at that task, right? Let's go with this assumption because you have been through a recruitment process. It's not like they found you on the street and they bring you in and then they test you to see if you can do a task or not. So you have to assume that the employee is capable of doing the task if that employee has been chosen for the role. Because, even in the recruitment process, you go through a recruitment process and then have maybe 100 candidates for a role, right? You pick the best one based on the initial assessments you've made. So I think many managers also come to the conclusion of, oh, that employee is not capable. Let's keep that a little bit. If you have that employee in your team, assume, first of all, that he, she is capable of doing the task. If we start from that assumption, then maybe what you have to think of, what does that employee need? And it's as simple as needing a headset just for quiet space, or just needing, for example, I've had it also myself, if I have to do a task where it requires creativity or creative thinking, like writing an article. If I would have to do that at the desk with 5 other colleagues where everyone has an input in here and there and there's noise around, believe me, I would sit there at the desk maybe even for 2 days and I would not have anything done that I would be happy with, or at least that I would be confident in giving forward or posting, publishing, right? But it's enough for me to give me 1 hour of focus time in my own space, which I could choose either in a quiet space or at home, and I will perform that task, and I don't need 2 days for that. So just having that understanding of what does that employee actually need to be able to perform that task, assuming that the employee is capable of doing, right? So once you think a little bit, just to put in an effort of understanding, then you might not need big projects or restructuring or whatever innovative things to implement to say that you are inclusive. Because it's often this assumption that inclusivity and all these projects require so much time and so much energy. Some might, for example, making an audit, it will take time, but it's sometimes really understanding the context first.
I think we are just freedom lovers. And when you're given freedom and the output has been clearly defined, we can achieve it. So it's really important for us to deeply resonate with the outcome of it. What are we trying to solve? What is it that we want to achieve? When that is clearly defined, and then you give freedom, I'm sure everybody can achieve it. So our focus should be on these things, understanding the people, understanding our colleagues, and just give a little bit of freedom. Who doesn't love freedom?
Yes. And also, I would say adapt. Now, I'll go with one more example to be specific as to what I mean. After COVID and during that time, we all know we transitioned to working at home. And then after that period of time, everyone wanted to come back into the office for very reasonable reasons, right? You wanted to be back into the office. You wanted to connect with colleagues. And then you'll have, based on my experience, I would work with managers who were so closed in as to the company has decided, like, and they put it very broadly, HR has decided 4 days in the office, no exception. Okay, let's say we bring in that policy and we have a policy that should be strict because you want people, or at least commit to change their habits and want to come back into the office. Okay, they do that. The engagement started to drop, not necessarily because people would come in to the office. The majority of employees were happy to have the opportunity, but that strict direction as to there is no other option. I'm asking you either come to the office or you leave the company. It's so drastic that puts someone in a position of, you know what, I'm sick today, I'm not coming into the office, or disengagement and they look for another job. And that's how you lose so easy an employee for a solution that could be a little bit more flexible. And in this case, a manager saying, we have this policy, let's adapt to it. Maybe we don't start from tomorrow or next week, everyone 4 days in the office. Rather, let's see how this works. And then have a one-on-one with each of your employee and kind of understand, is it possible? Because requesting something like doing something like this for everyone, making like a strict rule, might affect a lot of people who are in different kind of situations, even neurotypical brain who have maybe 3 children at home who cannot go to kindergarten or school, but they need attendance at home because of, maybe their school is not open, or there are various challenges that people go through and we don't know about them. It's not like we have to know about it, but at least be mindful and remain a little bit flexible, assuming that maybe not everyone can attend the office and be in the office 4 days in a week. And if this is really an ultimate goal for the organization, then make it a long-term vision. Like we envision, like we would want to engage more and we would want to make a progress for the next 3 months, let's say, that the attendance in the office increases, right? But then have that one-on-one with each employee and understand, is it reasonable for me to ask from that employee from tomorrow, command for him, her to come to the office without really understanding if it's possible or not, just because, and this is something very typical that I've identified by working with clients, it becomes more of an entitlement, like companies feeling entitled to request that from the employees just because it's a policy, you have to follow it. But when it's backward, like when it's vice, like it doesn't apply, there's double standard of company feeling entitled to put in rules. But when it comes from the employee side to come with a request, no, it's not possible, right? So being so close-minded that it's a lost opportunity, I would say, for many.
What would you say for needing to communicate needs themselves? How can they go about that? Because often is the case, you experience stigma, you experience pushback, you experience misunderstanding, infantilization, honestly, a lot of the time. How can they best approach that, like if they are needing those kind of needs?
I would go again with an example and saying that, for example, a lot of organizations take initiatives of implementing systems for engagement, right? They have a system, internal system that measure KPIs, or at least they put in goals there to see if the goals are being achieved. And they use the data to kind of identify whether or not that gets to be, well, to identify the challenges the employees have through the data they receive by sending surveys, questionnaires, and so on. But I also experienced that those questionnaires are very much business oriented only, which is not that it's bad, but through those kind of questionnaires, such as, do you feel safe at work? I mean, what can I say? I feel safe. And I would have employee come and like, I really don't understand what it means. Like, of course, I don't feel threatened in any way. What is actually safety means? Psychological safety is such a word. Like when you ask an employee if you feel your organization provides that safety, it's such a broad concept. For some with certain conditions might not feel safe if they feel threatened from a perspective of having colleagues screaming out loud, right? Or shouting, or even if it's in a funny way. And I'm not saying that they feel threatened in that sense of, somebody's going to hurt me now, but because of their different cognitive understanding of safety, they might take it differently than a neurotypical one, right? So how would that person answer to this question? Do you feel safe at work? You will answer yes, just for the sake of answering. And often this is how it goes. Like they will answer those surveys for the sake of answering it, but it doesn't bring anything. So let's take this example. The employee says yes, and then the person behind in HR, person behind that survey will read, oh, everything is fine. Like we are safe and there's no issue in there, right? That's an assumption based on a number that system has given you. I like the discussion I had recently with an organization who is trying to bridge that gap. And instead of asking, are you feeling safe at work? They go more in depth in understanding how do you best perform your tasks daily, right? And going a little bit more understanding, or at least getting from the employee, not a very broad answer as to, yes, I'm safe or not, rather how you prefer to, in what kind of environment you would prefer to work with, like even going more specific into your role. Do you feel listened by your manager? And so going a little bit and understanding the needs of the employee, and having received that feedback where you see a team is giving you feedback that they don't feel like you are listening enough, instead of, is that environment safe? It's a different kind of feedback that you get when you're very specific as to what you're asking, right? And then the manager can have a discussion specifically about, oh, I hear that you cannot work in a noisy environment. What can we do to accommodate that? Or maybe it's not applying to all the employees, but for that specific employee, right? So that is the kind of action you can get from being a little bit more specific than just data driven. Yes, I get it. Everyone wants to have some data behind because that gives them a reason to explain why they're so good at promoting inclusion, at making the workplace the best they can make it. And they use their assumption based on those numbers without putting some human interaction, human understanding into those factors. If the employee has answered that he feels safe at work, it will not mean that that employee really feels like she can perform that task and feels like can contribute the best of their capability in that specific environment. So to those managers who say, we have measured, we found out that we are doing great, let's move on, I would challenge that assumption if the assumption is based only on the number, only on the percentage of the employee answering that specific question, and go a little bit more in depth and really understanding the core of that question. What does that mean? And having the one-on-one with the employee and really getting the main reason, or at least the main definition of what is safety for my employees. Did I answer the question?
And then some. I could listen to a description of this all day. So much of work, honestly, it comes down to person-centered versus seeing people as a commodity. And that's what so many of employers tend to do, is people are a commodity and they are a thing you utilize. You don't use people as resources. When there is the threat, honestly, that you lose a neurodivergent worker, you've lost one of the best workers you could possibly have. Even if they're not particularly attached to the work they're doing, they're going to perform it at a very optimal level. They're not going to disengage from it actively when they're doing it, when they are supported to the best of, the company's ability, instead of to the best of what they feel like at any particular time, and expect results from that. And to that end, I'm curious what your thoughts are of if let's say an autistic employee reached burnout from their job and trying to keep up with it, like even if they have like some accommodations, there's not a ton, but they're in very hardcore burnout. How could either, they or an audit sort of intervene and help that employee who is very much suffering right now because of that? And how can they recover from burnout while retaining the job?
Well, I will answer this question from a perspective of the cultural experience that I have here, like in Europe, in Denmark. I would say it's a little bit different than US and maybe other regions. I would speak about this specific topic, referring mostly to the experience that I have. And again, every time I refer to something, it does not mean it's common everywhere, right? You have to really understand the context before you act. Based on some audits that I've performed in one of the organizations, for example, it was regarding whether or not we can accommodate autistic employees to the organization. It was an organization that wanted so badly they already put it out there in writing. We are making space for hiring employees who maybe not directly necessarily mentioning the autistic, but in the neurodiversity program, we encourage all brains to apply for the roles at our organization. It came through the audit very clear that even through the recruitment process, such brains will not come in, right? Not necessarily because they will not apply, but the recruitment process was so highly customized in such a way that it will indicate, will kind of ask with good intentions whether or not you need accommodation or not, right? So those CVs that would need accommodation would be filtered for a special kind of interviews, right? And then you will identify whether or not the candidate, what type of severity of accommodation that might need, and then they will come to a conclusion that we cannot accommodate that, we will not take into consideration. But that was not officially kind of openly stated. That unfortunately, it's very clear what type of accommodation we offer, and that we are making space for various neurodiverse brains. That kind of closed the gap between, it closed the opportunity for autistic individuals to apply even to the job. They were invited in the interview. They would make them feel kind of welcome, and they would give them the feeling of, oh, we would like to consider you for, but that was just for the sake of making it official that we do try to recruit, and ultimately it will not happen. I will not make this officially kind of label. I will not label or mention the name of which organization I'm referring to, because I don't think it's fair to point fingers in through such ways. But by identifying through the audit, right, understanding their recruitment process, how is the interview going? Is it really fair, or is it just on paper? It was very clear that not actually everyone would have a chance to be filtered through the recruitment process. So ultimately, the message was, we have tried, we haven't found, we have given kind of the opportunity, but it resumed everything to a statement that stayed there on the organization's website, which kind of pointed to, we are inclusive. But in action, nothing really has happened. And I would not call that inclusion. It's just a fake way of trying to accommodate or follow the rules as checkboxes. It is also becoming evident that, let's say, I have not directly worked with this, but I've read about practices like organizations who are genuinely trying, and they are making the process happen. And they have, for example, autistic, in the case of such people, they get hired. And they are very proud of that first step that they took into bringing in brilliant minds into their organization, which has helped them tremendously. It's like having someone with such brilliant minds in certain areas that you as an organization need is an advantage, no doubt. 1 year after, when you look at how everything has unfolded, that employee was not there anymore. Not because that employee was not able to perform the task, but because the inclusion was thought only as the first step that we make to bring in people, meaning that it's the recruitment process, we're making everything possible, and they were brilliant at making things happen. But inclusion does not mean an effort to make space for someone in your organization and adjust everything just to make space for that person that ultimately will not feel included, because everybody else will treat that person differently. We need to accommodate that employee. And ultimately, through the culture that the mindset and the entire culture that the organization had, that employee did not survive long time. And of course, the employee has survived, but will not stay because it's not supported long term. So in order for such initiatives to take place and really be successful, you cannot just start with either recruitment, or let's say successfully you've had someone, even though you haven't put much effort in the recruitment, but if you put a lot of effort in trying to train them and onboard them. If you do not bring awareness to the entire culture, like have managers really not only favor that employee, but walk the talk, like really practice this and engage with your other neurotypical employees, bring awareness and let them understand that it's not about bringing someone in special and make space for accommodation. Rather, how can we learn about how that person works, and how can we make this a workplace where that person feels like she belongs? And when you have the mindset of accepting and adopting such practices, you do not need innovative projects to make that happen long term. So you have to think it as a journey, not so much as an one-time action.
I think it's a lot about communicating with your heart.
Yeah.
It just comes down to that. And when you understand someone truly, everything just automatically fits in. And the environment is blossoming and everyone's happy. They want to stay. And that's what we should strive for. And also be productive. And I think naturally we become productive beings when that happens. So you had talked about culture. I'm really intrigued by culture, different from different countries and even within different locations, right? Because you had talked about different locations of the same organization. So, what defines culture in an organization, and how do you work with that?
Well, I will put it this way. When we discuss about culture, context is important, right? We need to understand the context, but also the global differences. When we go with the assumption that, oh, we have to be equal everywhere, has to be the same, I think we again make a mistake by assuming that we intentionally want to give equal rights and make everything equal, but it does not work. Like in real life, this will not work if you do not put an effort in understanding the context, the differences in culture and mindset, right? So when discussing neurodiversity globally, it's crucial really to acknowledge that what works in one context might not translate easily to another. That has to be from the very beginning clear. If we start with this assumption that we are looking at the context and try to understand the context, not based on what theory tells us that in practice we have to apply, but really understand what context am I talking about, then you have, at least you open a space where you can create something unique that works in that organization or in that space, right? So I would go with like saying that I see contrast and opportunities, and I would take the examples of US and the Nordic region, just because I come from, I work in this region, and I will take this for the sake of providing a little bit more clear example of what I mean. So for the United States, I would put it this way. The focus is on innovation, but fragmentation. And based on also existing research, but also what I've experienced working, for example, in organizations who have departments both in Denmark and in the US, the practices are not the same. In the US, I would say you see highly innovative programs, yes. And I'll give an example of Microsoft Autism hiring program. There is also another example that I've studied, the SAP Autism at Work. Those were two organizations that I focus my research on. They focus on leveraging neurodivergent strengths for high skills roles, which it makes sense. Like they understand what type of skills they need as organizations, and then they find solutions that work for them. These programs have truly inspired, and that's based on what I could find through the research. They have inspired many organizations to see neurodiversity not just as inclusion, but also as a talent strategy. However, the US system often lacks consistency across states and sectors. And while some companies offer, for example, coaching or mentorship and tailored onboarding for neurodiverse employees, others still struggle with basic really accommodation. And that is due to unclear federal guidelines or even lack of internal education. So an example comparing it with the Nordic countries, I would put it as rather, as I stated initially, United States being more innovative by fragmentation, but focus on fragmentation. Like it's not really everywhere the same. In the Nordic countries, the research that I found is rather more structured with slow implementation. So in Denmark, in Finland, and also Sweden, we benefit from stronger public support. That's something that a lot of research show, and it's true. I've been through the system. I think it's very supported in that sense of understanding the needs that people need to bring in, like adjustments in the workplace, for example. They also, for example, in Denmark, they have there are this solution of job rotation scheme, if you've heard about it, where it allows employees to take educational leave while unemployed individual, for example, including many neurodivergent people, they fill in temporary roles. This provides them a pathway into employment. So that's a solution, but it's a slow implementation kind of process. The systems are more holistic, I would say, here in the Nordic, but organizations still face challenges translating really inclusive policy into everyday practice. I think this is where we are currently, that there is not a lack of understanding. There's not a lack of what we actually need. It's rather focusing on identifying, how do I make this happen here in my context, in my organization now.
This has been so enlightening. I've definitely learned so much about different avenues that should be taken in these situations, and I think the cultural differences. I that's something I think this podcast itself has returned to over and over again. Is we've learned so much about the cultural differences and how these things are treated and how these systems are work and operate, and that has been such a barrier in of itself. Is having to navigate and go back and forth between all of these differing systems. And then you have each culture then has multiple systems in of itself, depending on what sector you're in and where you happen to end up. And it's just barrier to entry, barrier to entry, barrier to entry you encounter over and over and over again. And thankfully, there are people such as yourself who are doing the work and trying to make things as pain-free as possible. And for that, we really thank you for all the work that you do and how you're trying to change things for the better.
Well, I think there is still need to be done a lot of things. I would just want to conclude this whole idea of how I translate this and how I see it. I think we all look at a solution. If anyone would listen to this podcast, would think, what did I learn from here? And which tool would I use to go in and make that change in my organization or maybe in my own life, right? Employees, you find also employees who take action themselves. I would want to leave with this last thought, which it's very important to mention. Maybe I've said it already, but I think we need a mindset shift. We do not need necessarily an innovative approach to how we make this happen. It's rather approaching this topic with the question, why mindset shift and why now? And, in 2025, most companies do not lack tools. Let's be honest. It's not about tools. It's not about knowledge. What they lack is readiness. It's simple as that. Readiness, and maybe I already said that, you can give someone a perfectly crafted, inclusive recruitment tool, because we talk about recruitment. But if their hiring manager still expects, for example, culture fit over cognitive differences, you won't move the needle. So what they need is readiness and kind of openness to accept the reality of the feedback they are being given. For example, after an audit, right? I would go to an organization after an audit and suggest to them, from my perspective, what I've observed and what the solution is. If they're not ready to take in, they can use those materials and put them in their inbox and then forget about them. And I will end with a last example where I recently worked with a client who had, for example, invested in inclusive language training. They have updated their HR policies and also redesigned onboarding, which was suggested from the audit. But initially, their turnover rate for neurodivergent hires remained high. And why? Because frontline managers ultimately weren't aligned in mindset. They still said neurodiversity traits are exceptions. And this is the problem, when you label neurodiversity as something special or an exception to be accommodated rather than strength to be integrated. Once we introduce reflective, for example, workshops, so the action behind this, observing and seeing that, okay, we have taken action, nothing has happened, it didn't work, why not? And then the solution was to introduce reflective workshops that focused on unlearning neurotypical bias. That is also something that people need to be taken in consideration. It's not all about learning new things. Often it's about unlearning the biases that we have, right? So not just learning policies. We saw there a real shift because that's what the company at that time needed. They began, for example, assigning role based on energy flow and also cognitive styles, which were based on the assessment that we've made for the employee, identify their cognitive styles. They were able then to retain those employees. So ultimately retention increased, but they also did innovation metrics and cross-functional teams assessments. So based on these small actions, like really taking very small steps in unlearning what they thought they knew and their approach, so the mindset ultimately towards the actions they were taking, that has made a tremendous shift in the way they were treating people and the way they were engaging, and that's how they saw retention increasing and performance as well.
Unlearning, such an important trait, and being open-minded.
Yeah.
I think these two things will help us grow in ways which will help all of us. So thank you so much for enlightening us with your wisdom in this area.
Well, it's interesting because I also kept seeing on the articles you're writing and also the podcast that I've listened. I think there are so many stories out there that they are not told, and with every type of expert you guys engage with, it's not so much, for example, that you might build up an innovative kind of solution to how do we proceed from here, but rather really inspire maybe someone in that specific role to make a small action, like take one step into improving something. And again, I think you're doing a tremendous job at least speaking about it. And I like the fluidity of the conversation that comes naturally. I think that's what we need. We don't need so much that talks only about very specific outlined solution, but hearing really people who are doing the work and who experience change now in the moment when they do it. And yeah, based on the experience that they have.
Thank you for that. I like to think this is a fly on the wall. This is the conversation we'd be having whether or not recorder was on or not. So I love the verbiage change, by the way, of accommodation versus integration. And that is really something to keep in mind going forward, and great microcosm as well for just society in general. We can show things, we can accommodate things, but you're not truly changing the mindset around how these things are perceived. Then you're not really integrating them. Then you're not really utilizing them, and you're not really seeing them. So I want to thank you for that, and thank you for coming on the show. Where can everybody find you?
Currently, I also partner with another consulting agency where I feel like the impact not necessarily goes from having an educated HR in an organization who knows what to do. It's rather just reaching through, for example, an audit or a consulting session to really understand whether or not you need help. And yes, I do collaborate with the consulting organization that I just partnered with. And what we do there best is to promote the idea of helping organization by starting with an audit, meaning to meeting with the people, understanding what their needs are and what they want to achieve through inclusion, and really kind of understand what inclusion for them is. And I like to work this way because it allows me to customize solutions there on spot instead of thinking as a large in 3 years project as to how will we change everything in 3 years, and then you end up 3 years after things are changing because everything is so fast changing, and then they're not relatable anymore, right? So I like to work with very specific issues on spot, and anyone is interested in collaborating, just to reach out.
I'll be sure to include anything in the show notes for anybody listening, which of course you can find at sparklaunchpodcast.com and all of your favorite podcast listening methods. But on behalf of all of us here at Spark Launch, we will see you next time. This episode was brought to you by Sparkade, our ADHD game-based learning platform designed to spark focus, confidence, and joy through play. Join the waitlist today at play.sparkade.app/waitlist. That's play.sparkade.app.